15 po, witamy serdecznie. Proszę Państwa, witamy na kolejnym wykładzie otwartym, przedostatnim w tym roku kalendarzowym, a jeszcze dwa się nam zostały, jeden na początku grudnia i drugi na początku stycznia. Dzisiaj za chwileczkę pozwolę sobie zapowiedzieć wykład w języku angielskim, ponieważ dzisiejsza prezentacja będzie w języku angielskim. Przypominam, za tydzień, 1 grudnia, 9:15, wykład profesora Diru Tadaniego z Waszyngtonu, a 12 stycznia profesora Rainera Malamakiego z Finlandii, projektanta zespołu Żurawie na terenie Młodego Miasta. Tak więc proszę o tutaj skupienie się nad tymi dwoma tematami także. Okay, so I guess we can start officially right now. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome to another lecture, open lecture, which is organized jointly by the Fahrenheit Universities or Gdańsk University of Technology in this particular time, or at this particular case, and Office of the Gdańsk City Architect, which I'm also representing. Today we have a pleasure of welcoming Professor Andrei Frank, who came to us from UK, from the University of Birmingham. So welcome, Andrei. It's a pleasure to have you here. And the topic of today's lecture is, I guess, very much up to the current needs of our cities, and it's a very broad topic called greening cities. And I guess we are gonna learn today a little bit about what are the issues and solutions associated with this concept, which, as you know, is very much popular nowadays and important also for our cities. So, Andrea, the floor is yours.
I have to switch this on. Thank you, Piotr. Thank you for inviting me. I guess I have to thank also the city of Gdańsk for sponsoring today's talk. It's always a pleasure. This isn't my first time here. And I enjoy coming to Gdańsk. Now, I've been asked to talk about greening cities when we arranged this lecture. And having done a little bit of research, I'm wondering what I can contribute, because there's lots of things going on in this city already. You have a green mobility plan, you have an initiative to eliminate plastic by the city, green procurement has started, so it seems like you're quite on your way to become a green and sustainable city. Gdańsk has also qualified for the Green Capital Award, the European Green Capital Award 2023, together with cities like Warsaw, Krakow, and others. It is in an elite set of 16 making the shortlist for that award. Now, of course, the award will be announced next year in April, and perhaps my talk can inspire additional initiatives, and if you don't make it this year, then perhaps in the future doing so. The challenge, of course, with greening cities is it's an ongoing process. One of my colleagues, former colleagues, Professor Richard Cowell, wrote an article some years ago asking, are we there yet? Meaning, have we reached sustainability? Because we have been working towards that for quite a while. But of course we are not. And we still have to improve, and it will go on for many years yet to come. So, what will I talk today about? Greening cities. There will be 3 parts to my presentation. I first will sort of elaborate a little bit what I mean by greening cities and think about how we define greening cities. Then I'll move on to benefits and challenges and issues, some strategies and approaches with examples, and then hopefully we can have a good discussion answering all your questions. So from my point of view, greening cities, there's really two different definitions. So green in terms of sustainable, promoting renewable energies, photovoltaic, thermal energy, reducing energy use, making buildings more energy efficient by insulating, facilitating green transport or active transport like walking and bicycling. And of course installing sort of the infrastructure that we need, bicycle paths, as you can see on the picture, or charging points for e-vehicles, as we also see in the second picture. Waste and resource management, so more recycling points separating our garbage. Or it could be something much more literal greening, meaning public landscaping, creating more parks, reinstating urban forests, using nature-based solutions for water and management, for example, or even using spaces for food production in the city. Obviously, these two concepts are related. They're not, completely separate. They're linked, they're associated. So the first one is more about resource use, reducing emissions, waste which also produces methane and CO2. So really harmful greenhouse gases, which we're trying to avoid. Moving to renewable energies, a circular economy, and respecting overall the planetary limits, working towards greater socio-economic justice. Whereas the second concept is perhaps more applied, more practical, what we can do in really actual terms right now, recognizing the value of urban nature, bringing nature back to the city, designing with nature, as Anne Whiston-Spurn and others have proposed already in the last century. So it's not necessarily new, but it's coming back into the policy realm. Greening and restoring, healing the earth, as Ian McHarg proposed in the 1990s, in the later part of his career. Ideas of biophilia, that humans are really also part of nature. We're not separate, and we need nature for our well-being and indeed our survival in the future, to keep us healthy, away from mental illnesses, not just physical ones. So, on that point, it's perhaps quite useful to reflect how are these two concepts linked. Looking at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we see that really only two, Goal 14 and 15, explicitly mention nature in their text, in the associated text. And I'm getting old. So they remark how critical nature is to humankind's survival, providing us with oxygen, with help for regulating weather patterns, providing our food, so both fish and marine related foods, as well as land-based foods, plants and animals. And, mention how important it is to restore soils and our land, forests and so forth, for our livelihood and health. Of course, there are other goals. 13, climate action and building sustainable communities. But again, these are all linked, and it's only really a small part of the 17 goals overall, which I thought was quite interesting and astounding how little nature was mentioned. If we're going further, for example, looking at indices, how we measure our progress towards sustainability, this is the European Green Cities Index. Again, what we see is very little text from these 8 groups of indicators. The top bit on your left mentions Green Action Plan, but what does that mean? Is it really literally greening, or is it looking at the whole sustainability picture? Public participation in green policy. Again, this could be sustainable policy or actually looking at green space policy. So it's not quite clear what we mean by green management, green policy, and green action plans. So at the bottom, there is another one with green land use, and that might be the only one that really pertains to nature and green spaces in our cities. So again, from this whole set of indicators, very little looking at green space and literally greening the city. The last one I want to focus on, and there are many, many more, so you can really analyze them all, is the European Green Capital Award, the award that, for which Gdansk is one of the shortlisted cities. And again, there is nature and biodiversity as one of 12, and maybe climate change, adaptation and mitigation, somewhat related. But again, from 12, it's really not that many. A lot are looking at other issues. This is probably where nature features the most from all these points that I brought up. So overall then, the two things are quite related, but it seems like literally greening the city is only, a subset of the sustainability agenda. And maybe that's right, but I think in this day and age, this bed needs to be expanded. And I would like to focus on this in my talk today. This is the bit that I think has perhaps not made it so much into the political agenda and into the urban agenda as much as it needs to be. So, why am I saying this? Let me tell you. So, you are probably all quite aware of climate change and the threats from climate change. So, greening cities can actually help quite a lot, and I'll get to that. But what's looming, perhaps even more, is what a lot of scientists call the biodiversity collapse, or the sixth mass extinction. Have you heard, has anybody heard of the biodiversity collapse? Can you just raise some hands? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Who has heard of climate change? Yeah. So exactly my point. Practically all of you had heard of climate change, but very few of the biodiversity issue. But it will come, and it's a big one. So, climate change, as you all raised your hands, you're quite aware. Sea level rise, we're in a port city on the sea, so that's quite an issue. We will have more frequent weather events, flooding, storms. There's risk to infrastructure, to buildings, and because we often can quite well predict these things, we can prevent a lot of loss to people's lives, but economic costs are quite high of these events. Droughts, shortages of water in the summer, and that, of course, threatens infrastructure, but also food and agriculture production. These heat waves threaten lives of vulnerable people, elderly, who suffer more, especially if we don't have air conditioning. And we don't traditionally have air conditioning in the UK or in Poland. If we install it, it'll cause energy demands, even in summer, not just in winter. And that is something we don't want to have because we want to reduce CO2 emissions, right? So there is the potential of greater inequalities, of course. So what you can see, let me try if I can do this. Pointing. I don't know. Let me try this. You can see the cursor here. This is an image, a heat map of Birmingham, where I live right now. And so this is the inner city that's densely populated. Mid-rise buildings. It's not a high-rise building city, but less green spaces, and it's 3 to 4 degrees warmer in the summer on average than the outskirts that are leafy suburban areas. So it is 3 to 4 degrees in the summer is quite a big difference. If it's 28 or 32, you feel it, and it will affect you. So what about the other issue that I mentioned? Well, humans have taken over more and more space. Urbanization, we use land to build housing, we use land for agriculture, and that causes loss of habitat for other species. We overfished the oceans, up to 80% loss of different species there. And in the last 4 decades, so that's not very long, it's in my lifetime, it's in the professor's lifetime here, we've seen a 50% reduction of birds in Europe. Pollinators, bees, wasps, and other insects are also becoming quite rare. And I don't know if you drive a car, or if your parents drive a car. When I used to be your age or younger, and we used to take a road trip in the summer, we had to stop. Every time we stopped at a petrol station and filled up the car, we also had to scrub the windshield from insect splattering onto the car. Do you still have to do that today? Very little. And that's an indicator how much reduction there is of insects in our world. quite shocking. I drove this summer to pick up some belongings from Germany to bring it back to Britain, and I drove quite a lot. That's 1,000 kilometers one way and back, and I never cleaned my car windshield. So on the charts, you see here, the gray bits, the long bar, is where we were, and the reduction a few years ago. So that was the extent that the original amount of deserts and shrub fields. So this is kind of the vegetated areas, shrubs, tropical forests, boglands, and so forth. And you see how much they have declined. And the red bit was in the last 120 years. So there is not that much, but the massive decline overall. And we only have tundra still nearly at the original bit. So the natural extinction rate for mammals lies at about one species dying out every 500,000 years, but in the last 500 years, at least 80 mammal species have gone extinct. Again, that shows you it's a different level that we're facing at the moment. So we need to really start protecting habitat for other species, because eventually it will affect us. Yeah? So again, this is why we need to bring nature, or rethink our relationship with nature, and see how we can live with nature, maybe even restore nature to much more wilder forms of it. So, how can we do that? Is there anything new? Because green spaces in cities aren't really new. We had, even in the mid-19th century, so, 150 years ago, many city planners, architects in large European and North American cities advocated for parks. They said, we need parks. There's Frederick Law Olmsted in New York who, argued for establishing Central Park in Manhattan. And others in other countries, London, Paris, Berlin, Stockholm, everywhere parks were established. It was for improving health. People recognized that already early on. And also the social welfare. We could meet in these spaces, get to know each other, and so forth. There was persistent air pollution in London that underpinned the argument for paying for parks and park spaces, so children could get out and exposed to fresh air and light, because people were concerned about their health. And Abercrombie's park plan in London, of course, said we should have all forms of open space to be considered as a whole, coordinated into a closely aligned park system along existing and new roads and so forth. So already looking at a network of green spaces in our cities. So green spaces in our cities had different values over time. So there were private gardens for food and herbs, medicinal plants, Later on, elite hunting grounds of the kings and aristocracy were changed into parks for the general public to use. Victorian parks had a very social focus, so we can go out and stroll around and enjoy the weekend. And municipalities acquired the power to purchase land for park building as pleasure grounds or for public walking and airing. Later on, Berlin and other cities said we need to protect the nature. They started biotope mapping. And we have, of course, allotments and gardens for recreation, leisure, and food production. What we see today is much more of an emphasis of the multidimensional aspects and values and benefits of urban nature, the ecosystem's services. So recognizing that nature actually has a value to us, provides a service in terms of offering oxygen, cleaner air, and so forth to us as humankind and citizens. So, green infrastructure, that term became popular in the 1990s, popularized by American landscape architects in Florida, looking at changing the narrative, if you wish, reframing what green space is. It's not just nature. It's actually infrastructure, and by calling it infrastructure, it's compared to roads, to digital infrastructure, to something humans build as a network. We maintain it. It needs, money to build and some thought to how it can be best implemented. It gets a different, it's not just something that we protect. No, it's something we actively recreate to help preserve our lifestyle and help preserve humankind and our living conditions and quality of life. So it calls for active management, for rebuilding or actually building new. So it becomes a new thing. Can we actually recreate nature after we damaged and destroyed it for many years? And in the US, it became very quickly linked to the Clean Water Act and popularized by the Environmental Protection Agency, who used green infrastructure as a nature-based approach to clean water that they popularized by saying it's cheaper, a lot cheaper, than us building water treatment plants. And so they said, let's do this because it saves us money. So it was very instrumental in looking at infrastructure, green infrastructure like nature, helping us save money, being smarter at managing the cleaning of water. In Europe, early on, we had a much more multifunctional approach to green infrastructure. They saw the value for health benefits, mental health benefits, and deliver higher quality of life and so forth to communities, and that was popularized. But each of them is trying to create value in terms of economic value, starting to talk to economists about this. So it is a service, and it's changing our relationship to nature. So green infrastructure can be anything from allotments, street trees, to blue infrastructure, streams, canals, wetlands, sustainable urban drainage system, woodlands, playing fields, and so forth, as you can see in the box. And from about 2007, we see a growth in the scientific literature here, basically following a call from the funding agency, the European Union, into this area. And a lot of different disciplines got involved, anything from architecture, health, hydrologists, biologists, ecologists, planners, and geographers. And you can see from the start of that funding in 2007, it took a few years when the research was done, but then it really took off, and it's gone almost exponential, the interest and our understanding and knowledge around green infrastructure. And it has, inspired certain scholars to say, hey, GI, the green infrastructure, is a life support system. We need it. It's essential for communities. It's essential for humans. So that is why my talk today focuses on that bit of sustainability. So let's go through these ecosystem services in a bit more detail. The Millennium Development Goals, which were the ones before the Sustainable Development Goals, probably published around the time you were born, or maybe just shortly thereafter. These are 6 different ones. I'm going to talk about the first 4 in more detail. So, what are they? Provisioning ecosystems services. That's food production, cash crops, regulating, cultural and biodiversity. So, let's have a look. Green spaces, have always been used to provide food for us. But in times of crisis, there was very much a repurposing of leisure green spaces, private gardens, for food production. As you can see here, these are posters from World War II in Britain and in the US, planting a victory garden, help the war effort by growing your own veg and potatoes in the front yard, in the backyard, wherever you can find a spot. The black and white picture is actually a picture of the famous park in Berlin, Tiergarten, which here is an agricultural field. You can see in the background here the famous Reichstag, the Brandenburg Gate. No trees. Has anybody been to Berlin? You know how the Tiergarten looks like. It's a leafy tree, full of trees park. This is how it looked at the end of World War II. It was a field to feed us, provisioning ecosystem services. So, what happens today? This is closer to our current time, also in Berlin, because I go there quite a lot for field trips. This is bubbling back up as community gardens. So this is actually using unused urban spaces. This is a community garden in a former decommissioned cemetery, Prinzessinnen Garden, where they have these planters where people can actually learn about food production, because, to be honest, where do you learn it? Maybe in your school, but if your parents don't do it, how do you know how to grow your own veg? You know, here you can learn it, here you can socialize, you can have a cafe. This is one of my favorite places in Berlin. It was a former brownfield site, unused for many years. The development pressure wasn't that great, that somebody wanted to buy that piece of land and develop it. And a community group turned it into a community garden, growing vegetables, having a cafe, a meeting space. It's lovely green space here. That was done in the space of 7 years. So we can use gardening also and greening temporarily in our cities for land that's not used. It doesn't mean we can feed entire populations very easily, and experts tell us it's maybe 5 to 10% of the consumption of a city that can be grown realistically in urban gardens. That doesn't sound like much, but it can be actually 10% is 10%. We have to be, of course, careful because, if we want to grow more, we have to be aware of seasonality. We're living in a temperate climate, so agriculture is not always energy or environmentally friendly. We have to be accepting that tomatoes and strawberries won't be around all winter because it would be too hard and too energy consuming to grow them in a greenhouse and heat it, right? And have the lamps and the solar and the energy to kind of produce this. But the very progressive thinking mayor of Paris now seeks to create at least 30 hectares of rooftop gardenings for food production in Paris. So she is pushing for using spaces in the third dimension to offer that as gardens or urban agriculture in the city. The question is, and I understand some of you study architecture, others planning, do we need regulation? What do we need to change for our cities if we want to use roofs more extensively, not just for solar collection, but energy production, but also to put a load of soil on our roofs? They need to be stronger. We can't just put trees on every roof, it'll collapse, right? So there's some static and engineering issues here that we have to think about. Do we need different regulations? We can't just allow, sort of trees on every roof. Can we? Should we? What will happen? Something to think about from a planning point of view, but also from an architectural engineering point of view. So if we want to change our cities, there's a whole load of things that need to be considered. It's just, we can talk about it, but this needs to be thought about in terms of all its consequences, right? Moving on to the second set, which is regulating ecosystems services. Regulating in terms of the urban climate or the climate overall. Looking at air pollution, filtering air for air quality, or cooling in the summer. Now, green infrastructure cools by the process of evapotranspiration. So basically, plants are sweating and chemical reactions that will then cool the air and release water vapors. So they also reflect away more of the solar radiation than concrete and asphalt. And they produce shade in the summer, leafy trees in particular, which again cools the air in cities. And you might have perhaps experienced that yourselves going to a park in the summer. It's cooler. You're sitting in the shade under the tree. It's a few degrees cooler and more pleasant, right? So if we're looking at this, people, of course, have measured it. And on your right-hand side, you can see a thermal image of a roof in New York, where we see that the asphalt surface is about 7 degrees Celsius, whereas the grass is only 27, so less than half. So you would burn your feet walking barefoot on the asphalt, but in the grass it would be fine. So massive, massive difference. So if we plant more grass or more trees, it'll help manage, regulate the climate in cities. And that has been done by the city of Stuttgart, for example, who has a green roof policy since the 1980s, not only because of climate change and the heat, but because the city was fined by the European Union on a regular basis, not meeting air pollution standards. And the green roofs help also filter air and bind the dust. And so they're giving active incentives for office building owners, reducing taxes, and giving them subsidies to build green roofs in the city as a measure to have so many green roofs, as you can see on the picture, installed to help air pollution and cooling the city climate. So it can be done. It needs to be done probably with incentives for building owners, but it's up to the cities to instigate that. Now, you might think, oh my God, what is that? Where do we get the surface? And there's competition, of course, of land. So now we want food production, we want green roofs. We also want to use the sort of south-facing roofs perhaps for energy production. Well, where can we get all this space from for all this greenery? Well, how about green walls? And there is a company in Germany, and they're called Green City Solutions. And they're actively saying we need green walls and using moss, the stuff that most gardeners try to get rid of in their garden. They put pesticides, get rid of that nasty, mossy stuff, right? Because it's not the right thing, the right aesthetic that we want. Well, let's see if I can get this going, because back here, and I was told how to do this.
I would like to see cities covered in a green infrastructure.
But I think nature was the first designer. We need to start incorporating nature more into our lives.
Nature has so many years of experience, but it doesn't have the technology. But if you combine it, you get something beautiful out of it.
2011, I went back to Shanghai to my family, and I had an internship, a prolonged internship there, and I did a lot of outdoor activities, including sports. And after a while, I started to notice that my health deteriorated, and I didn't know where that came from. So in the beginning, I thought maybe I caught a flu, I caught the cold. So I stayed indoors, I reduced the activities, and it did get slightly better. But only when I went back to Germany, it completely vanished. And that's where I realized that it was the outdoor air quality that caused a massive impact on my health. Okay, now I was able to come back to Germany, but my family is constantly living in China. Wherever they go, they're basically exposed to the bad air quality, right? And that's when I got together with my co-founders. All of us, we shared a similar experience that when we were living in like those big cities, whenever we got close to nature, in a park, even like just a green wall, we immediately started to realize that the air quality was better and the air was more fresh and more cool.
We founded Green City Solutions to make the world a better place. What we are doing is we are combat the problem of air pollution, and we do this with the help of our nature.
Found out that there is a plant which is even more capable of binding fine dust and then converting it into biomass. So that's what really fascinated us.
Moss cultures have the ability to absorb our pollutants out of the air. They are over 500 million years old. Over 20,000 different species are on our planet. You find them in the desert, but also on the North Pole. So they are really adapted to their climate you can find them in. The initial idea was that we bring these mosses back to cities.
Moss literally eats all the pollution and then converts it into biomass, and this is unlike anything else on this planet.
Me and my team, we came up with our way of producing moss mats vertically, which nobody else is doing basically. We're also conducting a lot of basic research to understand the moss a lot better. Motivation for working for Green City Solutions and coming here to work every day is that I'm asthmatic. Actually, since I've been working here in the countryside, working a lot with moss, I haven't had to use my inhaler in months.
Whenever we talk about this product, people are like it's an eye-opener for them that the moss we use to clean the city is basically the same moss which is in their backyard or at a wall somewhere, and everybody thinks it's just something bad which you have to take out, but it's the opposite. So that's a beautiful thing that people have really this trigger of, oh great, now I know that it's part of the whole ecosystem which makes our lives better.
Our solutions are not meant to replace the trees, but it's about enhancing the ecosystem. You know, we have an advantage in front of every other solution in the market, which is a psychological factor, because we bring nature back to the city.
I saw a speech from the 90s where politicians talked about that we have to change our behavior and the CO2 output, and nothing happened. And now we see that things are starting to be better.
For instance, there's this one story about an installation we did in Budapest, and there was an elderly couple who lived really close by. They told me personally like how after we installed the city tree, the dust that was always covering the windows reduced for a while.
A product like ours, we can put it here right at Potsdamer Platz in Berlin, and people go there and see it and see, okay, great, this is like a positive example of how change can happen.
We are in a field of technology. We start to change, and that makes me also optimistic that we can do it, and that would be the biggest thing humanity would manage to.
So, did you know that? Who is aware of the power of moss 2, 3. So most of you have learned something new, I hope. At least something. And considering, have you heard of particle matter? Particle matter 2.5, the really fine stuff that gets into your lungs and into your bloodstream and can damage your brain cells. People speculate it causes more Alzheimer's and dementia. So moss can actually bind that. And looking at, even if we reduce carbon dioxide, the particle matter from electric cars, from the wear and tear of the rubber of the tires is still there. So even if we switch all to electric, we don't get necessarily rid of the PM 2.5. And that's the really damaging bit. So we need to really, really work on how to reduce this, because that's overall quite damaging to our personal health. There is, of course, not just the temperature and the air filtration, but regulating ecosystem services is also water management. So blue-green infrastructure can help us adapt to extreme precipitation and flooding. As you can see on the left side, it's the river Elbe, which is flooded, and there's flood defenses that were built. But, you know, it's very close to going over. And building more flood defenses, higher flood defenses, every few centimeters is quite expensive. And we don't really know how to predict how high that flooding will get. We cannot, the realization is we cannot build ourselves out of these threats. It's becoming more and more clear. But what we can do is adapt. We can make space for the water. We can create temporary space and get out of the way and create spaces where the water can go when it's too much and then retract without damaging urban human properties, houses, buildings, businesses. And that's what you see by renaturating rivers. So the second set of pictures shows a traditional river where we try to tame nature, where we try to control it. It's sort of straight lines. And then the renaturated bit on the next picture where we open the floodplain and just allow the water, if there's more water, to go places and without really damaging the village next door. And this has been used, actually, quite practically in many places now, and increasingly so, at various scales, regionally and down to the local level. So this is the city of Vienna, which traditionally has the river Danube flowing through it. And it has always, every 5-15 years, flooded massively, as you can see on this historic picture where people are paddling in boats through the city. But what they've done several years, decades back, they built an artificial island, the Danube Island. And you can use that now as a recreation ground. And there's a second arm of the Danube, and it's built such a way that the island can go underwater. So then, okay, We missed the park for a few weeks till it's cleaned up. But the water has space to go to this place without flooding the inner city, without damaging houses and residences, damaging businesses, right? So this is a big man-made island, man-made construction, but it looks quite natural now. It has huge benefits because you can go there, walk the dog, walk your kids, play, enjoy nature on this island. And the few times, every few years, when the flood waters get high, it gets closed off, the water level rises, parts of it go underwater, but, you know, no livelihoods are changed and damaged. This is a new big project in the UK, city scale, and you can see it's a public-private partnership between the water company, Severn-Trent Water, and a city. They want to change public spaces, creating rain gardens, sustainable drainage systems, and so they're improving public space with greenery, but they're also increasing water management. And you can see £76 million investment is no small sum, and they think it'll pay off very, very quickly, rather than having to clean the water, as well as in amenity spaces for the public sector, for, you know, making the city more livable, more attractive for tourism, and so forth. So, massive investment that will start next year, and it's a real turnaround what water companies and cities are thinking in doing, how to manage public space, make it more attractive, bring nature back into the cities. Yeah? And that's in a relatively conservative country, in a country that measures every pound and looks, is there economic gain? It's not just beautification. They really have calculated it through that it will pay off in the future, that we green this space. Right? So it's not, you know, some marketing stunt. With a private company, private water company involved, you can be sure they calculated this through, that it makes economic sense. This is another at the neighborhood scale, and I like this project because it has real social benefits. You can see here, this is a river here, and these 10 streets here have been changed. It's an innovative project by the city, inspired by a city engineer, and again, with the water company involved. Now, you need to know, in the UK, rainwater runoff cannot be just sent into the river. It needs to be cleaned. So the motivation here is that this rainwater, the water runoff here, needs to be captured by a sewage system, and in this case was pumped 8 miles to a water treatment plant. Now that costs energy, that costs money, and at the time this was conceived, energy costs weren't as high as they are now, right? But at the same time, it also changes streets from quite drab, gray, hard-surfaced, to something much more pleasant. So the property values here have gone up. It's much more pleasant with these rain gardens. And the slope here on these short little streets is just enough to make the water run through the rain gardens clean it enough so it can go untreated into the river. And so it's a win-win situation because this is a low-income ethnic neighborhood that gains a lot of green space. These are now play streets. These are much more usable, much more biodiverse. Birds, bees, everything coming back. Kids can play on these streets. It's much more pleasant. And the water company saves a lot of money pumping the water 8 miles away. So they figured it will pay off in about 10, 12 years. I reckon it's probably reduced now to 7 or 6 with the rising energy cost. We have 127 new trees, 1,700 square meters of new green space, 108 rain gardens, safer road junctions, and over 0.5 kilometer bicycle paths and streets established. So all around, quite a positive project and inspiring other projects like that Mansfield one that's now starting. So this cost about 8 million, and the wider benefit will be much, much more. So how does that work? Regulating services are cooling and water management. So it's all about flattening the curve for water management. You all know this probably from COVID management. We have to flatten the cases. If the caseload is too high, the hospitals can't manage, the health service can't manage. But so the same with water. The more green space we have, the more water will be captured in that green space before running into the sewage system. The less green space you have, the bigger your pipes have to be to handle all this. So the more population, the less permeable surfaces you have, the bigger your underground infrastructure and the more expensive your underground infrastructure. So you can see we have in a very green space park, you have only 10% runoff, 50% infiltration that will be soaked up. The Chinese call that sponge cities, like a sponge. The water is soaked and capped in the area and then slowly moves into the water circulation system. So it's all about when we have a big rainfall and it rains a lot, we want to sort of lower that and spread it out how water runs off. And again, of course, we get more evapotranspiration, cooling, the more green spaces we have. Here we have only 30%, here we have 40%, here we have 10% runoff, here we have 50% runoff. So you can see how that works. Yeah? So we want to maximize green space that can soak up and cool at the same time. Finally, let's get to, not finally, second to last, cultural ecosystem services. So based on the biophilia hypothesis, meaning we as humans have evolved for thousands, 10,000s of years in nature, and only the last, 300-400 were really urban animals, maybe the last 50. And so human reactions, we have an innate tendency, that's the hypothesis, to focus on life and lifelike processes, and we have a deep connection to nature. So contact with nature is really important to keep us healthy. And this is captured in this diagram here. So green space, we can go out, we have social interactions, we meet people and other, in the park, for example, we talk to neighbor, we talk to strangers. That makes us feel better, and there's social cohesion, and that has an impact on our mental health. But physically, it also has an impact, and it decreases stress, decreases blood pressure, heart rates, hormones, stress hormones like cortisol, and again, mental and physical health is impacted. So feeling nature, you know, I don't know if you read about this, isolated people during the pandemic were being advised to hug a tree because you weren't supposed to hug friends under social distancing rules. But others, for therapeutical reasons, are also advising going forest bathing and all these kinds of esoteric sounding things. But it might actually really help make you feel better. Maybe try it out sometimes, if you haven't already. Now, a lot of doctors, physicians have done actual research, and there is evidence, and mounting evidence, that children in classrooms with a view of trees and greenery have higher attention span than those who are not. Adults have lower frustration. The view of nature after surgery, you need less medication for painkillers. So, and it leads to less complications, shortens hospital stays. Now that's a real economic benefit, but also a personal benefit if you can go home to your family quicker. It helps Alzheimer sufferers if they get out into gardens. And greenery, of course, encourages physical activity, walking, bicycling, and that combats diabetes and heart diseases and obesity. So green space is good for us, and it's medically proven. These are real studies that you can look up. Now, this is my final point in terms of the ecosystem services. Halting and reversing biodiversity loss. So, we know we need pollinators for food production, because if we don't have that, we won't get pears and apples and peaches and apricots and so forth. So if our pollinators are lacking, it has a real impact on our food yields, and that has an impact on our nutrition. If there's more malnutrition, it will reduce economic activity and productivity, because if we're ill, we're not as productive. So there's also a heightened infectious disease risk, because if our body isn't well fed, and we cannot fight off diseases as easily. So, real issue there. The question is, how can we get that done? How can we get biodiversity back into our cities? Well, we can do that, but it requires a real change in our management practices. It requires careful interventions. These are pictures I've taken this summer at the Association of European Planning Schools conference in Tartu. Tartu is nominated for the City of Culture, and they want to increase biodiversity in the city actively. So they're changing some of their park space, not mowing them as much. And so wildflowers can come back. But it has had some real negative reactions from citizens. Does the city now not have enough money to probably mow the lawns, or what's going on? People were really upset. You know, it changes and challenges our aesthetics, what we expect a park to look like. Green, mowed grass. You can't really easily sit into that, but you could. But it kind of is not what we expect. And of course, the park department was also not happy, because they're mowing only 2 or 3 times a year. They need different machinery. They can't just kind of take the sit-on lawnmower and run across and leave the little grass splits sitting there. No, now they have like big, you know, hay, basically. What do they do with that? Where do they put it? They have to cart it off. They have to feed animals, whatever. But it's not that they can leave it on the lawn. It'll destroy it. It'll suffocate the grass. So it will require a rethinking of how we manage public green spaces. And it will require re-educating the public that this is important, this is good. Not tamed, minimalist nature, but the wilder bits of it. And that's more beneficial for us, but our parents might not necessarily agree. They think it's kind of unkempt, uncared for, right? So there is a fear of this untamed nature. You know, we might be stung, there might be diseases. And, you know, to some degree, there may be more ticks, there might be more mosquitoes, depending if we're further south. So we have to kind of start managing this and think about it. There might be more leaves in the sewage. There might be other things that we need to think how to deal with it. Well, that's what I'm saying. We need a real rethink of managing our relationship. So there is real benefits that we can list if we're going at the different elements of green infrastructure, and we can see which ones are providing what services. So there's a lot of pluses, but what about drawbacks? You know, are there any? Can you think of any? So overall, these nature-based solutions are seen as positive in terms of social well-being, health, quality of life. But environmental ethics and social ethics are not the same, and they don't go hand in hand. So what we're seeing now is something called green gentrification. So urban renewal, you know, a district is upgraded, we're fixing all the houses and the paint, and you know, the inside of the apartments are getting upgraded and renewed and insulation put on. And what happens? The rent goes up. The same happens if your green space around a place is improving, rent goes up, property values go up. And what that means is those who cannot afford it, students, elderly, poorer segments of the population get pushed out, get displaced. Gentrification. And so we also see market-driven increases of green space, that developers actually really try to make the environment around their new developments very nice. Install green spaces, sustainable development sustainable drainage systems to create really high property value, because you have this positive amenity space. So it is a two-edged sword, and we need to, as planners and architects, think about how we manage this. There's good examples in both Europe and in New York, for example, around the very famous High Line, a park where a former railway connector was transformed into an urban park at the higher level. Property values went up 100%. So quite stark. So none of you would be living there, and I wouldn't either. So, these are sort of things that we have to think about. If we install more green infrastructure, where do we put it? What kind of effects or after effects will that have when we do? And so there's a stark warning that, not all places are equal. So we have to really worry about that. So what can we do? Coming to the final bit of my presentation, implementation. We have to really think about what we want to do and how. Being clear what we mean when we talk about green infrastructure. Is it bicycle paths? Is it trees? What are the trade-offs in terms of environmental and social? Being aware of the barriers, funding, planning, maintenance, design. So the cost of installing green infrastructure often can be raised quite easily, but then who pays for the long-term management? Who cares for the trees? Who waters the trees? The city of Berlin now has reopened the old water pumps. Piotr knows about this. So you can pump water from the water system to actually help street trees in the summer and water them for free, because you don't have to take your own water, but you can get public water for free. So it lowers the barriers, involves citizens to care for trees. We have to, manage the few negatives like leaves in the drainage, allergies, and so forth. And we have to think holistically. So how can we do this? One of the biggest issues, that example for Cardiff and the little street greening faced, was the silo organization in the city. So the water engineer had this ingenious idea, but then how do we get that implemented? And the water department said, well, you want trees, rain garden, that's the parks department. The parks department said, no, it's water, it's yours. Nobody wanted to pay, because they say it's not in our budget. So you have to kind of overcome this from a financial point of view. You have to create a pot of money for these interdisciplinary projects where multiple departments are involved. You either have to create a fund for multi-dimensional purposes and projects, or however you want to organize it, but you have to overcome these traditional silos in terms of the government structure, because otherwise it's like, oh, they pay for it. It's not in our budget. They pay for it, and then it never happens, right? So that's a big thing. And then, of course, all of them benefit, right? So we have to really think, how can we make the most out of it? So the EU, ever so helpful, has created a toolkit for an urban greening plan guidance. It's not finished completely, but you can look up and they sort of helpfully have these different stages of creating political support, involving stakeholders and so forth. But that's kind of one level of organizing it. We still have to think more practically, how can we do it? And we're all doers, we're designers, we're planners, we want to change things. So how can we do it? How can we, should we, go back to erase things and build it new, or should we gradually change things? Now, it might help to think gradual transition for existing neighborhoods. How can we make them gradually cleaner? So greener. Initially, there might be no greenery. How can we, add maybe some street trees? And maybe we don't need all these buildings and can remove some and have some more park space. And that happened in shrinking cities quite a lot, where population leaves, where you don't need all the residential buildings in, former industrial areas. And you can eventually come to a much greener space. You can also, each time you have to renew a road, think about how can we make it better? How can we integrate more permeable asphalt, more permeable paving, more a green berm, etc. Can we have a bicycle path separated by greenery from the main road so bicycling is more pleasant? Each time you renew a bit of infrastructure, can we put, instead of new sewer pipes, can we put a rain garden in? How can we, really strategically change our environment as we do regular maintenance anyway? Because we have to do that, and we do that on a regular basis. But we have to stop and say, no, let's not do business as usual. How can we do it in a different way? Each time there is a new bit of infrastructure going in, wait a minute, how can we do this differently and better? Yeah? And then, I don't know if you know this project. This is one of my favorite projects. Have you seen this? Hammarby-Sjöstad? Yes? No? Maybe not? It's in Stockholm, Sweden. And it used to be a former industrial area, a harbor, and the Swedes had a bid for the Olympics, and they wanted to build the Olympic athletes' village there. So that was the start of the project for the Stockholm Olympics. They didn't win that bid, but they still went ahead with the project and built an overall new district on this former industrial site. And what I think the beauty is, they had a lot of multidimensional radical systems thinking put into this. The lead was, because it was a toxic industrial site, the city bought the land. They were the lead developer and then sold off bits for development. But they held sort of the strings together, the main ideas. And the main ideas was also to use this development to try out new ideas. So here's some bit for context. It's very much in the city center on the water. And it's quite a large site, 250 hectares, ultimately to house 25,000 people, apartments, plus also some commercial. They wanted to reduce the car use by 10% and energy and water use by 50%. And it's, of course, built inward in the city. So, reduce the transport needs by extending the tram lines, but then they wanted to very much look at the natural cycle at the local level. minimize consumption of resources, and utilize, for example, sewage for energy extraction. Use a lot of renewable or recyclable building materials. Because the city was in charge, they could instigate that, require that from any developer to do that. Restore the lakes and use what they learn for future developments as innovations. And one of the things that it shouldn't get more expensive, right? So let's see how they fared. They developed a master plan in collaboration with many actors. High design standards, passive house, good insulation, and connected that to the public transport network. It's all good. Now it looks really nice because they had rainwater collection and filtration, very similar to that project you've seen in Cardiff, where the streets and that are green roofs, green reed beds, and that filters into the Baltic Sea, ultimately. Wastewater, sludge is used, and the dry mass is used as fertilizer. And we have biogas production, which then goes into vehicles, but also heats 1,000 of those 8,000 units of residential. There's district heating, and in the summer they use the water from the lake to cool buildings. So quite a lot of thinking into the technology. So I'm not saying technology is bad, sorry, but we need to use it together in an intelligent manner. They also instigated something I was quite skeptical about initially, where you see these boxes where people put their waste in, and then the waste is sucked underground to a central place where then there's a sensor and tells the waste company when the receptacles are full and they can pick it up. And I thought, oh, it's an awful lot of technology and very expensive to have this, right? But the argument is that you don't need to build the roads for heavy goods vehicles. And they only come when it's full. So they don't come on a regular basis because some receptacles are full and others not, because they get alerted when they're full. And by building the roads to a lower standard, and not these heavy goods vehicles that have to go through all these residential areas, you actually save money, and there's less pollution with these dumpsters going down and going down the roads. So overall, this is being implemented now more and more in various areas. This is a schematic graphic that shows really how they were looking at the whole development as a network, as a system, where, you know, things, go from waste to fertilizer to the field, to heat production, where, you know, things are almost circular. Not 100%, we're working on it, but, you know, overall you can see how things are mapped out, how things are interlinked, how things in close proximity are feeding off each other and exchanging materials, heat, goods, energy. And that's you can download that from the web and study it in greater detail, as I can do now. The one thing with all this technology and high-tech development is you need to bring the population with you. So when you move into Hammerschweißerstadt, you get a pack, a citizen's welcome pack. It tells you about, you know, all these insulating features in your new apartment or home. It tells you how to use the fancy waste management system properly, so you're not putting the things in the wrong bins. It tells you what benefits you're actually having, how much energy and things are you saving by, you know, complying with the ask, what you should do. But you know, as people move in and out of a residential area, you need to educate people as they kind of transition through, right? So they have this extra little glass huset, this building here, which is part of the development, which is an information center for visitors, but also residents. And it helps keep up good recycling rates, good waste separation, and so forth. So you're not using the technology in the wrong way, but you need to give people the chance and the opportunity to learn about it as well. So this public involvement is found to be key if things like that happen. Now the goal was 50% reduction. That's on a modeling basis. We're always higher on that. That's the theoretically important bit. But they still achieve 30 to 40%. Let me wrap up. So in sum, good for the prompt, Piotr, greening cities need to be regenerative cities. We need to kind of think in these circular terms. And let me just finish with a quote from my famous architect. We must learn to green the earth, restore the earth, and to heal the earth. So why not start with the concrete jungles of our cities, where a majority of humans now live? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea, for this extremely interesting talk. I guess it's very much appropriate for the issues which we are dealing with right now, not only in Gdańsk, but in the entire Poland and Europe, actually. I guess we do not have much time for questions, but if there are any burning questions or points which somebody would like to make, please come over here, because as I mentioned, it's all recorded, so we want to capture your points as well. Any questions or issues? Well, I mean, Andrea will be around for a few more minutes, so if you have any questions, please ask them then in private. I have actually one thing I would like to ask you. What did you recommend to start with?
Ooh. What do I recommend to start with? I think what I would start with is mapping or being aware of the assets you have, and look for opportunities that are easy wins. So, are there any vacant sites that are not used? What can you possibly do with the involvement of the surrounding community? Can you, create some temporary space, perhaps as a first sort of, but being aware of what's there, and then the other bit is going back to the sort of social justice bit, is looking where is a real lack of green space, where's real, sort of deprivation that we can improve greenery, and there's this term of just green enough, having some green, but without, changing property values that much. So it's these two things I would start.
Thank you so much. So, as I mentioned, since we are a little bit over time, if there are any other questions or issues, please ask them in private. Andrei will be around for a few minutes here. So thank you very much. Just for information, I have already transferred a gift from the city of Gdansk to the hands of Andrei. It's already in your hotel room, so, so you don't have to carry this big and heavy book around. So thank you so much for coming over, and this recording will be made available to the general public. I hope that each and every one of you will come back to that. Also, the presentation, I have the copy of that in case you want. I guess Andrei will allow to send it to be a PDF version of the whole thing, as not all the things might have been easily readable on the screen. So, thank you so much, and hopefully see you around again soon in Gdansk. Thank you.
Yeah.